The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air itself was holding its breath. Every eye was fixed on the man standing at the front of the room, his polished badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. He stood tall, his posture radiating confidence, as if the weight of his authority made him invincible. This was a man who had spent years building a reputation. A man who believed his badge was a shield, protecting him from consequences. But today, that shield was about to crack. And it all started with the woman sitting quietly in the corner, her eyes sharp, her presence unshakable. She wasn't just another face in the crowd. She was the one person who could bring him to his knees, and he had no idea what was coming. It had all begun months earlier, in a small town where everyone knew everyone, and secrets were hard to keep. Officer Daniel Grayson was a name that carried weight. He was the kind of cop who walked into a room and commanded respect, not just because of the badge on his chest, but because of the way he carried himself. He was the guy who always got the job done, the one who never backed down. But there was another side to Daniel, one that only a few people had seen. Behind the confident smile and the firm handshake was a man who believed the rules didn't apply to him. He'd cut corners, twisted the truth, and used his position to get what he wanted. And for years, it had worked. No one dared to challenge him. No one. Until her. Her name was Evelyn Carter, and she wasn't from around here. She'd moved to town 6 months ago. A quiet woman who kept to herself. She worked at the local library, spent her evenings reading, and rarely spoke unless spoken to. To most people, she was invisible, just another face in the background. But Evelyn had a past, one she didn't talk about. She'd seen things, experienced things that had hardened her, made her wary of men like Daniel Grayson. And when their paths crossed, it wasn't by chance. Evelyn had been watching him, piecing together the puzzle of his corruption, one small detail at a time. She knew what he was capable of. And she knew he'd never stop. Not unless someone stopped him. The day everything changed started like any other. Daniel had been called to testify in a routine case, one he thought would be open and shut. He walked into the courtroom with his usual swagger, nodding at the judge, smiling at the jury. He didn't notice Evelyn sitting in the back, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression unreadable. As he took the stand, he began to speak, his voice steady, his words carefully chosen. But then something unexpected happened. Evelyn stood up. She didn't shout or make a scene. She simply raised her hand and said, "Your Honor, I have something to say." The room froze. Danielle's smile faltered. He turned to look at her, and for the first time, he felt a flicker of doubt. Who was this woman, and what did she know? Evelyn stepped forward, her movements calm and deliberate. She didn't look at Daniel, not yet. Instead, she addressed the judge, her voice clear and unwavering. "I have evidence," she said. "Evidence that proves Officer Grayson has been abusing his power for years." The room erupted in murmurs, but Evelyn didn't flinch. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder, thick with documents, photos, and recordings. Daniel's heart sank. He recognized some of the names, some of the dates. How had she gotten this? How had she known? He tried to speak, to interrupt, but the judge raised a hand, silencing him. "Let her finish," the judge said, his voice stern. As Evelyn began to lay out her case, the tension in the room grew thicker with every word. She spoke of bribes, of evidence tampering, of lives ruined by Daniel's actions. She had witnesses, people who had been too afraid to come forward until now. And then she turned to Daniel, her eyes locking onto his for the first time. "You thought your badge made you untouchable," she said, her voice steady but laced with anger. "But you brought the wrong woman to court." Daniel's mind raced. He tried to think of a way out. a way to discredit her. But the evidence was overwhelming. The shield he'd relied on for so long was crumbling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. But this wasn't the end. As the judge called for a recess, Daniel's mind was already spinning with plans. He wasn't going down without a fight. He'd find a way to turn this around, to make Evelyn regret ever crossing him. And Evelyn. She knew this was just the beginning. She'd seen the look in his eyes, the desperation, the rage. She knew he wouldn't stop, not until he'd silenced her for good. As she walked out of the courtroom, her heart pounded in her chest. She'd started something she couldn't back away from, and now there was no turning back. The battle lines had been drawn, and only one of them would walk away unscathed. The story was far from over. What would Daniel do next? How far would he go to protect his reputation? And could Evelyn survive the storm she'd unleashed? The answers were waiting, just out of reach, in the next chapter of this gripping tale. But one thing was certain. This wasn't just a story about a corrupt cop and the woman who stood up to him. It was a story about power, justice, and the lengths people will go to when they have nothing left to lose. And it was far from over. Though recess felt like an eternity, Daniel Grayson sat in the small, dimly lit room just off the courtroom, his hands clenched into fists on the table. His mind raced, replaying every word Evelyn had said, every piece of evidence she'd presented. How had she gotten all of that? Who had talked? He'd been so careful, so sure he'd covered his tracks. But now, it was all unraveling, and he couldn't afford to let that happen. His badge wasn't just a symbol of authority. It was his life. Without it, he was nothing. He had to find a way to shut this down, to silence Evelyn before she could do any more damage. Across the hall, Evelyn sat alone on a bench, her folder clutched tightly in her hands. She could feel the weight of what she'd started pressing down on her. But she didn't regret it. Not for a second. She'd seen too much, endured too much, to let someone like Daniel Grayson keep getting away with it. But she wasn't naive. She knew this wasn't going to be easy. Daniel wasn't the kind of man to go quietly. He'd fight back, and she needed to be ready. She glanced at her phone, checking for messages. There were a few. Friends from out of town. People who knew her story, who were rooting for her. But no one here. No one she could trust. She was on her own, and she knew it. The town itself seemed to hold its breath as word of the courtroom drama began to spread. It wasn't every day that someone challenged Officer Grayson, let alone in such a public way. People whispered in the diner, at the gas station, in the grocery store aisles. Some were skeptical. Daniel had been a fixture in the community for years. The kind of cop who showed up at school events, who helped old ladies cross the street. It was hard to believe he could be capable of the things Evelyn was accusing him of. But others weren't so sure. They'd seen the way he operated, the way he seemed to always get his way, no matter what. And then there were those who had their own stories, their own reasons to distrust him. They watched from the sidelines, waiting to see how this would play out. Evelyn's past was a mystery to most people in town. She'd arrived quietly, without fanfare, and kept to herself. But those who paid attention might have noticed the way she flinched at loud noises, the way she always sat with her back to the wall, her eyes scanning the room. She'd been through something. That much was clear. And whatever it was, it had left its mark. She didn't talk about it, not even to the few people she'd grown close to. But it was there, in the way she carried herself, in the way she fought so fiercely for justice now. She knew what it was like to be powerless, to have someone in authority abuse their power, and she wasn't going to let that happen to anyone else, not if she could help it. Daniel, on the other hand, had always been an open book, or so it seemed. He'd grown up in this town, played football in high school, joined the police force right out of college. He was the kind of guy who knew everyone, who could walk into a room and instantly be the center of attention. But there was another side to him, one that only a few people had seen. His ex-wife, for one. She'd left town years ago, taking their daughter with her, and she rarely spoke to him anymore. There were rumors, of course, whispers about why she'd left, about the fights they'd had, but no one knew for sure. And then there were the people who'd crossed him, the ones who'd found themselves on the wrong side of his badge. They knew what he was capable of, but they were too afraid to speak up. Until now. As the recess dragged on, Daniel's thoughts turned to his next move. He couldn't let Evelyn's accusations stand. He needed to discredit her, to make her look like a liar, a troublemaker. But how? He didn't know much about her, not really. She'd kept to herself, stayed under the radar, but everyone had secrets, and he was determined to find hers. He picked up his phone and made a call, his voice low and urgent. "I need you to dig up everything you can on Evelyn Carter," he said. "Everything. I don't care how small it is. Find it." He hung up, his jaw tight. He'd find a way to turn this around. He had to. Evelyn, meanwhile, was thinking about her next steps too. She knew Daniel wouldn't take this lying down. He'd come after her, try to intimidate her, maybe even threaten her. She needed to be ready. She'd already taken precautions, changed her routines, installed security cameras at her house, but she knew that might not be enough. She needed allies, people who could help her if things got ugly. But who could she trust? The town was small, and Daniel had friends in high places. She couldn't afford to make a mistake. As the recess ended and people began to file back into the courtroom, the tension was palpable. The judge took his seat, his expression unreadable. Daniel returned to the stand, his face a mask of confidence. But Evelyn could see the cracks beneath the surface. She took her seat, her folder still in her hands, her heart pounding. This was far from over. The judge looked at her, then at Daniel, and finally at the jury. "Let's proceed," he said. Evelyn stood up again, her voice steady as she continued to present her case. She called witnesses, people who'd been too afraid to come forward before, but who now found the courage to speak. Each one added another piece to the puzzle, another layer to the story of Daniel's corruption. But Daniel wasn't idle. His lawyer objected at every turn, trying to discredit the witnesses, to cast doubt on their stories. It was a battle, every word a skirmish, and the outcome was far from certain. As the day wore on, the stakes grew higher. Evelyn could feel the weight of the room's attention, the pressure building with every passing minute. She knew she was taking a risk, putting herself in the line of fire. But she also knew she couldn't back down. This was about more than just Daniel Grayson. It was about justice, about holding people accountable, no matter how powerful they seemed, and she was determined to see it through. But as the sun began to set and the judge called for an adjournment until the next day, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. Daniel's eyes met hers across the room, and, for a moment, she saw something in them that made her blood run cold. He wasn't just angry, he was desperate. And desperate men were dangerous. She packed up her things, her hands trembling slightly, and walked out of the courtroom. The weight of what she'd started heavy on her shoulders. Outside, the town was quiet, the streets empty, but Evelyn knew better than to let her guard down. She glanced over her shoulder as she walked to her car, her senses on high alert. She didn't see anyone, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She got into her car, locked the doors, and took a deep breath. She'd come too far to turn back now, but as she drove home, the darkness closing in around her, she couldn't help but wonder what the next day would bring. The battle had only just begun, and the stakes were higher than ever.